My ex-husband, Dan, and I had been divorced for 3 years. A period that felt both brief and long in its own way. When we first met, we shared a vision of the future that included a life without children. I was resolute in my decision never to have kids. And he had agreed that while he wasn't completely against the idea, he wasn't particularly interested in having them either. Our agreement was clear, and it was one of the fundamental aspects of our marriage. For a while, our life together was fulfilling. We had a good routine. We both pursued our careers with enthusiasm. And our relationship, while not without its challenges, seemed stable. But everything changed about 4 years into our marriage. Dan began to express a growing desire for children. At first, it was a subtle hint here and there. But it quickly escalated into a full-blown insistence. He wanted a family, and he wanted it with me. I tried to understand his change of heart. I did, really. I considered the possibility of becoming a mother. But deep down, I knew it wasn't right for me. I was content with the life we had built together. And I felt that going against our agreement would be a betrayal of the trust and commitment we had established. When it became clear that our desires for the future were irreconcilable, Dan made the decision to leave. He filed for divorce, stating that he couldn't continue in a marriage where our visions of the future were so fundamentally different. The end of our marriage was painful, not just because of the separation but because of the abruptness with which it happened. Dan's desire for children had become a deal-breaker, and it felt as though our years together had been swept away in favor of a new dream that didn't include me. The divorce was finalized, and Dan wasted no time moving on. Within months, he remarried and, not surprisingly, his new wife was soon pregnant. Over the next few years, Dan's life seemed to follow a predictable script. He had 2 children with his new wife, the second of whom was born with a disability. From the snippets I heard through mutual acquaintances and social media, Dan's life appeared to be a whirlwind of sleepless nights and financial strain. His new wife had gained weight after the pregnancies, and it seemed that the idealized vision Dan had of fatherhood and family life was quickly dissolving into a reality he hadn't fully anticipated. Meanwhile, my life took a different trajectory. I completed my higher education and secured a high-paying job in healthcare. My career was flourishing, and I found satisfaction in my work and the independence it afforded me. I had also started considering the possibility of settling down again, though I was in no rush. Life was good, and I felt a sense of accomplishment and peace with my choices. Then, one morning, Dan showed up at my doorstep, his face etched with distress. I was initially shocked to see him. We hadn't been in contact since the divorce, and I wasn't sure what to expect. I invited him in, offering him a drink and trying to process the surreal nature of his visit. His emotional state was striking. He was crying, his voice cracking as he spoke about the misery of his current life. As he detailed his complaints, I was struck by the irony of his situation. He spoke of how he despised his children, how the financial burden of raising them was crushing him, and how his wife's weight gain and lack of intimacy had created a chasm between them. Dan even mentioned that his wife's constant yelling and dissatisfaction had driven him to the brink. He lamented that he wanted a divorce from his new wife and that he regretted leaving me. It was clear that he saw me as a potential solution to his problems. As though he was hoping that by returning to me, he could somehow fix the mess he'd created for himself. I listened to his lamentations with a mixture of disbelief and astonishment. The audacity of his visit, the way he expected sympathy from me, and the sheer irony of his situation were overwhelming. Here was a man who had discarded me in favor of a new life that he now found unsatisfactory. And he was looking to me to remedy his newfound dissatisfaction. The more he spoke, the harder it became to maintain my composure. His sob story felt like a twisted form of karma, a consequence of the decisions he had made and the promises he had broken. I found myself struggling to suppress my laughter, the absurdity of the situation striking me as almost comical. How could he not see the poetic justice in his predicament? He had prioritized a fantasy of parenthood over our marriage, and now he was suffering the consequences. When he finally paused, his eyes red and pleading, I couldn't help but let out a small laugh. It wasn't meant to be cruel, but it was a reaction to the sheer ridiculousness of the situation. I told him that his problems were a result of his own choices and that I had no interest in rekindling our relationship. The idea of taking him back seemed preposterous. I had moved on and rebuilt my life in a way that brought me fulfillment. Dan's reaction was immediate and intense. He called me an asshole, his voice shaking with anger and hurt. He accused me of being unsupportive and told me he thought I would handle his return more gracefully. His outburst only reinforced my belief that his visit was an exercise in futility. He had hoped for sympathy and perhaps even a chance at reconciliation. But instead, he was met with the reality of his choices. After he left, I reflected on the visit and the emotions it had stirred within me. I questioned whether my reaction was justified. Was I wrong for finding humor in his suffering? Was it inappropriate to see his situation as karma? Part of me felt guilty for laughing at someone in distress, even if that someone had once been my husband. But another part of me felt that the situation was a stark reminder of the consequences of his decisions and the value of the boundaries I had set. As I went about my day, I wrestled with these conflicting feelings. I didn't want to seem callous or insensitive, but I also recognized that Dan's situation was a reflection of his own making. His visit had forced me to confront the lingering bitterness I felt about our past and the way our lives had diverged. In the end, I resolved to focus on my own path and to accept that Dan's return, however unexpected, was a reminder of why I had made the choices I did and why I had moved on. The experience was a sobering reminder of the complexity of human emotions and relationships. It was easy to feel righteous in the moment, to see Dan's suffering as a form of poetic justice. But it also served as a reminder of the importance of empathy, even when dealing with those who have hurt us. As I continued to navigate the aftermath of his visit, I hoped to find a balance between acknowledging the reality of his situation and remaining true to my own sense of dignity and self-worth.
For the past 8 years, my life revolved around my wife, Clara. We had been together for a little over 5 years, and I always believed that our relationship was built on a solid foundation of love and mutual respect. We had our share of ups and downs, but the idea of infidelity was something I never seriously considered. To me, our bond was too strong for that. But 4 months ago, everything changed. It began subtly. Clara, who had once been my confidant and partner in everything, became distant. She was always on her phone, her attention seemingly elsewhere even when she was physically present. The conversations we once shared dwindled into awkward exchanges, and she began avoiding meaningful discussions. It was like living with a stranger who happened to occupy the space of my wife. One day, my suspicions were confirmed in the most jarring way possible. I found a message on her phone that was unmistakable. She was seeing someone else. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. The anger, sadness, and betrayal were overwhelming. My heart felt like it had been ripped from my chest and thrown into a void where I could do nothing but watch it disappear. It was a gut-wrenching experience that left me feeling hollow. Despite the whirlwind of emotions, I made a deliberate choice to hold off on any confrontation. My primary motivation was to protect myself. If a divorce was on the horizon, I wanted to have solid evidence to support my case. For the next 2 months, I operated under a facade of normalcy. I went about my days pretending everything was fine while the betrayal simmered inside me. I spent countless hours collecting evidence, messages, photos, and any other pertinent information that could be useful if the situation escalated to legal proceedings. During those months, I watched Clara with a detached sense of observation. Her behavior remained unchanged. She continued to act as if everything was perfectly normal, unaware of the turmoil that was building within me. Each day, my feelings for her diminished further. The love I once felt for her was replaced by a deep-seated indifference. I had always thought that love was a constant, but I learned that it could be eroded by betrayal and deceit. When I finally had enough evidence to be confident in my decision, I confronted Clara. The confrontation was not dramatic, it was methodical. I laid out everything I had gathered, piece by piece, the photos, the messages, the incriminating evidence. I presented it all. Her initial reaction was one of denial. She tried to deflect, to downplay the seriousness of the situation. But it was clear from the evidence that her affair had been ongoing and serious. Eventually, Clara admitted to the affair. She claimed it was a mistake, a lapse in judgment, and that she still loved me. She expressed a desire to work things out, to fix what had been broken. But by that point, I was numb. My feelings had been buried under layers of indifference and detachment. I didn't scream or cry. I didn't even feel the anger I had expected to experience. I simply looked at her and said that it was okay, that we could get a divorce, and that we should move on with our lives. Clara's reaction to my indifference was one of utter bewilderment. She said that my coldness and lack of emotion were cruel. That if I had truly loved her, I would have fought to save our marriage. It was a bitter irony coming from her. The very love she claimed was still there was something she had cast aside when she chose to betray me. Her accusations of cruelty seemed hollow against the backdrop of her own actions. The truth was, I did love her deeply. It was only after enduring months of silent suffering and watching her continue her life as if nothing was wrong that I found my feelings for her had dissipated. The betrayal had been so profound that it erased the emotional connection I once had. I was left with a sense of detachment that I hadn't anticipated. As I reflected on the situation, I grappled with the question of whether I was in the wrong for my reaction. My indifference seemed to be the ultimate outcome of my pain and betrayal. A defense mechanism that had shielded me from further hurt. Yet, it felt unsettling to realize that the person who had once been my everything had become so insignificant to me. The process of dealing with Clara's infidelity and my subsequent indifference was a journey of self-discovery. It was a painful lesson in the fragility of trust and the complexities of human emotions. The betrayal had altered my perception of our relationship and my capacity to feel. The love that had once seemed unshakable had been dismantled by deceit and dishonesty. As the days passed, I focused on moving forward and rebuilding my life. I found solace in my own personal growth and achievements. The process of healing and redefining my sense of self was slow. But it was necessary. I was determined to find happiness and fulfillment outside of the shadow of my past relationship. The experience had taught me that emotions are not always as enduring as we might believe. The love I had for Clara had been genuine, but it had been irrevocably changed by her actions. My indifference was not a sign of coldness, but rather a natural consequence of the emotional wounds inflicted by her betrayal. In the end, I realized that my indifference was a form of self-preservation. It was a way of coping with the pain and moving on from a relationship that had been marred by infidelity. Whether or not I was wrong for my reaction was a question that would remain complex and nuanced. But I knew that I had to prioritize my own well-being and happiness as I navigated the aftermath of Clara's betrayal.